Ever wondered if thinking too much could actually kill you? Did some of history's greatest minds meet ends as peculiar as their thoughts? Number 7. Hypatia, torn apart by an angry mob. Was being a female intellectual in ancient times dangerous? Could teaching mathematics lead to a violent death? In the bustling city of Alexandria in 415 CE, Hypatia made her daily journey to the library where she taught mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She was no ordinary teacher. As the daughter of mathematician Theon, Hypatia had grown up surrounded by scrolls and intellectual debate. She became the first well-documented female mathematician and an extraordinary philosopher in a world dominated by men. Hypatia's death came not from natural causes, but from the swirling political tensions of Alexandria. One fateful day during Lent, a mob of Christian zealots, reportedly led by a man named Peter the Reader, pulled her from her chariot. They dragged the philosopher to a church called Caesareum, stripped her naked, and killed her using sharp oyster shells to tear her flesh. As if this wasn't horrific enough, they then burned her dismembered body. What led to such brutality? Hypatia had become entangled in a political conflict between Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, and Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. As a close advisor to Orestes, Hypatia became a symbolic target. Some accused her of practicing witchcraft or preventing a reconciliation between the political rivals. Others simply resented a pagan woman holding such influence. Whatever the exact motivation, her death marked the end of the classical age in Alexandria. Hypatia never wrote down her philosophical views directly. What we know comes through the writings of her students and contemporaries. She taught Neoplatonism, believing in a hierarchy of being with the One at its summit. She also made important contributions to mathematics, including commentaries on Apollonius's work on conic sections and Diophantus's Arithmetica. The brilliant philosopher who once said, "Reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all," was silenced in the most violent way imaginable. Her death became a cautionary tale about the dangers faced by intellectuals when politics and religion collide. Number 6. René Descartes, the philosophical tutor who caught his death in the cold. Can an early morning teaching schedule actually kill you? Did the father of modern philosophy die because of the Swedish winter? I think therefore I am. This famous declaration came from René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher who revolutionized Western thought. But thinking couldn't save him from a bizarre end in the freezing Swedish winter of 1650. Descartes had spent most of his adult life in the Netherlands, enjoying relatively warm weather and the freedom to develop his radical ideas away from the religious authorities of France. Then came an invitation he couldn't refuse. Queen Christina of Sweden, an intellectually voracious monarch, requested that Descartes come to Stockholm to be her philosophy tutor. Flattered, the 53-year-old philosopher packed his bags and headed north in 1649. Queen Christina had some peculiar study habits. She insisted on philosophy lessons at 5 a.m., yes, before sunrise, in her unheated library during the bitter Swedish winter. For Descartes, who had developed a lifelong habit of staying in bed until 11 a.m., claiming that his best thinking happened while reclining, this schedule was torture. After just a few months of these pre-dawn lessons in freezing temperatures, Descartes caught a respiratory infection. The man who had methodically doubted everything except his own existence couldn't doubt the pneumonia ravaging his lungs. He died on February 11, 1650, far from his beloved France. Adding to the strangeness of his demise, after his death, Descartes' body took a journey almost as winding as his philosophical inquiries. Initially buried in Sweden, his remains were exhumed 16 years later and transported to France, minus his right index finger, which a French official kept as a souvenir. During the French Revolution, his remains were moved again. Today, you can visit his tomb in Paris, though some scholars question whether all the remains inside are actually his. The irony wasn't lost on his contemporaries. The philosopher who separated mind from body ultimately couldn't escape his physical form's vulnerability to cold Swedish mornings. Number 5. Socrates, death by hemlock cocktail. Would you drink poison to stand by your principles? How could asking too many questions lead to a death sentence? In 399 BCE, in the democratic city-state of Athens, a 70-year-old man who had spent his life questioning everything raised a cup of poison hemlock to his lips and drank. That man was Socrates, often considered the father of Western philosophy, and his death became as influential as his life. Socrates never wrote down his ideas. Everything we know about him comes from his students, particularly Plato. He wandered the streets of Athens, engaging citizens in conversations that exposed contradictions in their thinking. His method, now called Socratic questioning, involved asking simple questions that gradually revealed the flaws in people's assumptions. This made him both beloved by some and intensely irritating to others. The official charges against Socrates were corrupting the youth and impiety, not recognizing the gods of the state. But the real reasons were far more complex. Athens had just restored democracy after a brief, violent period under the 30 tyrants, some of whom had been associated with Socrates. His questioning of democracy itself and his influence on young aristocrats made him politically suspicious. When the guilty verdict came, Socrates had the option to propose a reasonable alternative to the death penalty. Instead, he mockingly suggested he should receive free meals for life at the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic champions and war heroes. This didn't go over well with the already irritated jury. Socrates could have escaped. His wealthy friend Crito arranged everything for a jailbreak, but Socrates refused. He argued that he had made a tacit agreement to obey the laws of Athens by living there and enjoying its benefits. Breaking those laws now, even unjust ones, would be wrong. So on the appointed day, surrounded by friends, Socrates drank the hemlock. Plato describes the scene in the Phaedo. Socrates walked around until his legs felt heavy, then lay down. The poison gradually worked its way up his body. His last words, according to Plato, were, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius, please pay it and don't forget." This peculiar request, offering a sacrifice to the god of healing, has puzzled scholars for centuries. Was Socrates thanking the god for the cure of death? Was it a joke? Or simply the practical last thought of a man settling his earthly affairs? Whatever the meaning, Socrates faced death with the same calm rationality he had displayed throughout his philosophical life. As he had taught, the unexamined life is not worth living. He examined everything, including how to die with dignity. Number 4. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the last words of a linguistic revolutionary. Can a philosopher's last words perfectly encapsulate their life's work? What happens when one of the greatest minds of the 20th century faces his own mortality? Tell them I've had a wonderful life. These were allegedly the last words of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian-British philosopher who revolutionized our understanding of language and meaning. But like many aspects of Wittgenstein's life, even his death carried layers of complexity and contradiction. Born into one of Europe's wealthiest families in 1889 Vienna, Wittgenstein could have lived a life of luxury. Instead, he gave away his inheritance, fought in World War I, worked as an elementary school teacher in rural Austria, designed an architecturally unique house for his sister, and became a hospital porter during World War II. Oh, and he also completely transformed philosophy, twice. Wittgenstein's health began to deteriorate in the early 1950s. By 1951, doctors had diagnosed him with prostate cancer. He moved into the house of his doctor, Edward Bevan, in Cambridge, England, where he continued to work despite his illness. His final philosophical notes were later published as Uncertainty. As death approached, Wittgenstein expressed a desire not to die in a hospital but in the home of friends. His Cambridge physician connected him with Dr. Bevan, who agreed to take him in. Wittgenstein spent his final days in the Bevan's spare bedroom. On April 28, 1951, knowing death was imminent, Wittgenstein reportedly said to Mrs. Bevan, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." He died the next day with these unexpectedly optimistic words as his legacy. What makes these last words so striking is that Wittgenstein had lived a notoriously troubled life. He struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts from his youth. He was known for his intensity, his exacting standards, and his difficulty forming relationships. Many who knew him described him as tormented. Yet at the end, he characterized his life as wonderful. Was this a moment of peace for the troubled genius? A philosophical stance on accepting one's fate? Or perhaps a final exploration of how language can create meaning rather than merely describe it, a central theme in his later philosophy? Wittgenstein's body is buried in the Ascension Burial Ground in Cambridge. His grave is marked by a simple stone cross, a fitting monument for a man who, despite his wealth and genius, embraced simplicity and wrestled with faith throughout his life. His tombstone carries no philosophical quotations, perhaps because he knew better than anyone that the most important things cannot be said. Number 3. Simone Weil, the philosopher who refused to eat. Can compassion kill? How far would you go to stand in solidarity with suffering people? In August 1943, in a small town in England, a 34-year-old French philosopher and mystic named Simone Weil died of cardiac failure. The official cause was tuberculosis, but the real story is far more complex and heartbreaking. She had essentially starved herself to death. Weil's life was marked by a fierce commitment to experiencing the suffering of others firsthand. Born to wealthy Jewish parents in Paris, she could have lived a comfortable life as an academic. Instead, she took a leave from teaching to work in factories, wanting to understand the lives of industrial workers. She fought briefly in the Spanish Civil War, though her poor eyesight and clumsiness made her a liability, and she participated in the French resistance during World War II. After escaping Nazi-occupied France, Weil found herself in England, working for the French resistance in exile. As news of the suffering in her homeland reached her, she made a fateful decision. She would eat no more than what she believed her compatriots in occupied France could eat. The problem? Weil's information about French rations was outdated and inaccurate. She was essentially starving herself based on incorrect data. Furthermore, her tuberculosis required higher caloric intake for recovery. Doctors and friends pleaded with her to eat more, but she refused. Her self-imposed starvation wasn't simply an eating disorder, though psychological factors surely played a role. For Weil, it was a philosophical and spiritual act. She had developed a complex theology that saw suffering as potentially redemptive and believed in the moral imperative to share in others' afflictions. In her philosophical writings, Weil explored the concept of decreation, the idea of undoing the self to make room for God. "We participate in the creation of the world by decreating ourselves," she wrote. Her refusal of food can be seen as a literal decreation, a dissolution of self in solidarity with others. After her collapse, she was taken to the Grosvenor Sanatorium in Ashford, Kent. Even there, she reportedly continued to refuse food beyond what she calculated French citizens could access. She died on August 24, 1943, with the medical examiner noting that she had essentially committed suicide through starvation. Weil's death embodies the central paradox of her philosophy. Her profound compassion manifested in ways that ultimately destroyed her ability to help others. As she herself once wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." She paid attention to suffering so intensely that she could not survive it. Number 2. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who embraced a horse. Can a mental breakdown lead to philosophical insights? What happened when one of history's most provocative thinkers lost his mind? On January 3, 1889, in the Italian city of Turin, a peculiar scene unfolded that would forever change the course of philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher known for declaring God is dead and exploring the will to power, witnessed a horse being whipped by its driver. Overcome with emotion, Nietzsche rushed to the horse, threw his arms around its neck to protect it, and then collapsed in the street. This emotional breakdown marked the beginning of Nietzsche's mental decline. He was taken to a psychiatric clinic in Basel, Switzerland, where doctors diagnosed him with progressive paralysis, likely caused by syphilis. The brilliant mind that had produced "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," "Beyond Good and Evil," and other revolutionary works would never recover. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Nietzsche lived in a twilight state of insanity, first under his mother's care and then, after her death, under the supervision of his sister Elizabeth. The philosopher who had written so provocatively about power, morality, and the Übermensch now sat silently in chairs, occasionally mumbling or playing piano fragments. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Nietzsche's mental collapse was that it happened just as his works were beginning to gain recognition. During his days of lucidity, his books had barely sold a few hundred copies. As he sat in silent madness, his fame grew exponentially. Adding another layer of tragedy, his sister Elizabeth, who controlled his literary estate, was a German nationalist and anti-Semite ideologies Nietzsche himself had explicitly rejected. She selectively edited his unpublished writings and notes, published posthumously as The Will to Power, to align with her own political views and those of the nascent Nazi movement. When Nietzsche died on August 25, 1900, after suffering 2 strokes, he had been mentally absent from the world for over a decade. The philosopher who had written "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow" spent his final years without any apparent why or how, trapped in a mind that had once soared beyond conventional thinking. What caused Nietzsche's breakdown? The traditional explanation of tertiary syphilis has been challenged by some modern scholars who suggest other possibilities: bipolar disorder, a brain tumor, frontotemporal dementia, or even CADASIL syndrome, a hereditary stroke disorder. We may never know for certain. What we do know is that the moment with the Chiron horse represents one of history's great philosophical ironies. The man who criticized compassion as a weakness and celebrated the sovereign individual had his final public act be one of spontaneous empathy for a suffering animal. As Nietzsche himself might have appreciated, the universe sometimes has a darkly poetic sense of humor. Number 1. Pythagoras' death by bean field. Could a vegetable actually lead to a philosopher's demise? What happens when a mathematical genius has to choose between his life and crossing a bean field? Around 495 BCE in southern Italy, one of history's most influential mathematicians and mystics reportedly met his end because of beans. Yes, beans. Pythagoras, the man whose theorem about right triangles you suffered through in high school, supposedly died while being chased by enemies because he refused to run through a bean field. Pythagoras founded a quasi-religious philosophical community in Croton, southern Italy. His followers, known as Pythagoreans, lived by strict rules that included mathematical study, vegetarianism, and various odd prohibitions. One of their strangest taboos, beans. Pythagoreans were absolutely forbidden from eating, touching, or even walking through fields of beans. According to the most colorful account of his death, written centuries later by Diogenes Laertius, political enemies were pursuing Pythagoras. His escape route led to a field of beans. Rather than violate his own rule by crossing it, he stopped at the edge, allowing his pursuers to catch and kill him. Why were beans so problematic? Ancient sources offer several explanations. Some suggest Pythagoras believed beans and humans were created from the same material. Others claim he thought beans contained the souls of the dead, based on their resemblance to embryos or testicles. More practical theories suggest he noticed beans caused flatulence or that some of his followers had favism, a genetic disorder causing severe reactions to fava beans. The bean field story is just one of several conflicting accounts of Pythagoras' death. Another version claims he died in a fire when enemies burned down the house where he and his followers were meeting. Yet another says he starved himself to death after his political influence waned. We may never know the truth about Pythagoras' demise because he was already a semi-legendary figure during his lifetime. He left no written works, and his followers attributed all their discoveries to him. The historical Pythagoras is obscured by layers of myth and reverence. What we do know is that the Pythagorean community combined mathematical research with mystical beliefs. They discovered the mathematical relationships in musical harmonies, developed the Pythagorean theorem, though evidence suggests it was known earlier in Babylonia, and may have been the first to propose that the Earth is spherical. Pythagoras taught that numbers were the key to understanding the universe, a view that continues to influence science today. His community also believed in metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, which led to their vegetarianism, except, apparently, for the specific ban on beans. Whether or not beans actually caused Pythagoras' death, his end reminds us that even history's greatest minds lived within specific cultural and religious frameworks that sometimes led to decisions that seem bizarre to modern eyes. The mathematician who discovered eternal truths about triangles may have died because of a peculiar taboo, a paradox he might have appreciated, given his fascination with the relationship between the timeless and the temporal. Have you ever wondered what your last act would say about your life's philosophy? Will your final moments reflect your deepest beliefs or contradict everything you stood for?